Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. Today marks the 38th anniversary of John Carpenter's cosmic horror masterpiece, The Thing, and my good friend Berto has joined me once again to discuss our favorite elements that make this a timeless classic. Berto, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
No problem. I always love having you on and getting to shoot the shit about horror movies. And we certainly have a fantastic one to talk about today.
Yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah.
I guess it became a classic, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like this movie, especially for people of our generation, we kind of use it as a benchmark with which we kind of measure a lot of other horror movies that have monsters. Like you always hear people comparing movies that have a focus on practical effects to The Thing, I feel like.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. So, it's definitely one of those movies that I feel like even at the 80s, I don't know if other than The Exorcist, that kind of effect, I feel like this is probably one of the first movies that I've seen where it has like slime weird monster looking thing. It's just like, I personally, I haven't watched many of the 70s scary movies, but it seems to me like this is probably one of the first ones to do that monster slime, gross looking thing. For sure. It's definitely unique on its own. Like, I think you were telling me that this took a while to catch on to people's attention. So it's definitely unique on its own, I think.
Yeah, that's a great transition because it's wild to me that when this movie came out in 1982, like it was largely panned to the degree that John Carpenter thought he would never work again. Which is just an insane thing to think looking back. Like, it's hard. We've only discovered this movie probably 10 years ago when we were like 18 or something. We started kind of catching up on some of the older horror movies that we didn't grow up with. And like, this is at the top of the list and remains there. So John Carpenter's The Thing is actually a remake of a 1951 movie called The Thing from Another World, which is actually an adaptation of a 1938 short story titled Who Goes There. So John Carpenter's is actually a remake of an adaptation of a book. So there's this kind of generational history to this movie that you don't really know about initially, because I don't know about you, but I didn't know that it was a remake. And I, of course, didn't know about a novel that came out in 1938. And it kind of just shows how these films can be evolutions of something. Like the novel introduces the setting and the concept, and then the first adaptation kind of brings that to life in a unique way. And then we get John Carpenter's vision for it, and it's infinitely more terrifying than either of the two things that preceded it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of cool that, you find, I guess it's interesting that you said that it's not his original story. Like he found it somewhere else. It's kind of cool. Like just thinking about that and the way, I guess, he interpreted it just makes it just so creepy and gruesome, and just the way he goes about it. I think it's got his uniqueness, and I guess that would see why people would take a while to catch on to it, because it can be pretty gruesome and at the same time kind of gross with all the legs sticking out when the monster starts creating. That's kind of I guess people who have like phobias and stuff like spider freaks me out.
Yes.
Every time.
So John Carpenter's version the screenplay was written by Bill Lancaster. And in the Carpenter version, much like the source material it's derived from, The Thing is set in the Antarctic at an American research outpost. The team's kind of barren boredom is broken when a Norwegian helicopter hunting a lone husky dog lands at the camp. And then as we see very quickly, like it's very confusing, the intro, because when the Norwegians show up, they start shooting at the dog and you're like, what the hell could this have anything to do with what's this all about? Like, it's such a strange way and a confusing way to open a movie. And then we learn once the Norwegians have been killed, we learn along with the American team that the dog is actually carrying this shape-shifting monster, which slowly begins to infect and kind of take on the appearances of the individual remaining crew members.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that intro scene where it's like, why would you want to kill a dog? Like, out of all the things, especially the dog is beautiful. It's like a beautiful dog. It's like a wolf husky kind of mix. And it's like, oh man, that dog is it's a beautiful dog. Why the hell would you want to kill a dog? It's just innocent dog running for its life. But then, yeah, like you said, you slowly get to develop the story, and yeah, it's kind of it's a pretty slow introduction, I would say. But I feel like the more you learn, the more you get to know the characters, and the story starts revealing itself. You kind of get more hooked into it.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, that's how I felt. It kind of it's a slow beginning, but then the more time it takes, like, or not the more time it takes, but like the more you keep watching, you kind of realize, oh, it's more than just a dog.
Yeah, the film really has a distinct opening that it is slow to sort of begin introducing the actual concept of the movie, but I love
Yeah.
the tone that Carpenter sets right from the outset, where
Yeah.
it's this very like barren wasteland. He even compares
Mhm.
like these long scenic shots of the Antarctic where there's nothing but snow and kind of these ice capped mountains. He describes it as being like apocalyptic in a way where there's just nothing, there's no life.
They're like isolated
Yeah,
almost.
exactly. They're isolated away from hundreds or thousands of miles from civilization or even an entire other continent away. But even though, so the point that I was going to make is that once we're introduced to like the first living life in this barren place, it immediately begins with hostility. Like the only
Yeah.
two people that, or the only two living things that we see are in some kind of conflict right from the start. And kind of just this
Right.
auspicious beginning where we're completely in the dark about what's happening, why it's unfolding. We just know it's kind of like very violent in a way that,
Mm.
again, kind of sets the tone for the movie. Whereas if we didn't have that violence, the audience might be led astray and kind of like figuring out what this movie is actually going to be about. But we know that it's
Right.
an isolated place, and a majority of the time, like violence will be occurring, or violence will
Yeah.
be the result of what happens when living things, people, interact
Yeah.
with one another.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the part where you said like talking about the tone of the movie. I feel like the soundtrack also has a great influence, and I think that it's like a certain like the soundtrack. It's like a certain like hunting monster kind of
Mm-hmm.
uh rhythm, I guess, to the beat. It's just like a single note that just keeps repetitively playing. It almost reminds you of like the Predator, which I think I have a feeling that the Predator was filmed later on,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of years later, and I think they kind of took that from John Carpenter's movie, The Thing. But it has like this like almost alien beat to it.
Yeah.
The music, which kind of gives it this tone of like something strange is really happening, and they're isolated, and like why are they out here?
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of shows you like what almost like shows you the way of what's coming in a sense. But yeah, it's definitely that. Going back now to your recent comment about the interaction with them, it's very intense, I guess, for like the first minute, like the first time they see human other than their group.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like all of a sudden it's violent. You hear gunshots, they're dropping bombs coming from a helicopter, and it's like one of the American guys gets shot in the leg. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what the hell is going on? And then they literally I think the Sweden or is it Norwegian?
Norwegian.
Norwegian. They get out of the plane and they start yelling at them like because they're holding back the dog. It's like you look at this innocent dog and it's like, well, there's a language barrier there that they can't really communicate. So it's like, what the hell is he saying? Why are they trying to hunt this innocent dog?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of opens up a whole new story once the guy gets shot, and they're like, oh, now we got to figure out where are they coming from, why are they hunting him.
Yeah, it's kind of
awesome.
It really speaks to the fact that you obviously don't realize until you've watched the movie for the first time that the movie could have been over in the first 5 minutes.
Right.
Like if there wasn't that language barrier, and if somehow like cooler heads were able to prevail in communicating, like, but again, I guess there's no real way you can communicate that a dog is carrying a shape-shifting monster,
Right.
without the other person being like, this person's clearly fucking nuts.
Insane. Yeah.
But it's just interesting, like going back, it's one of the elements of horror movies that I really love, in that if someone had done if they had made a slight change to how they allowed something to play out, the entirety of like the chaos that eventually ensues during the course of a horror movie could have been avoided. It's kind of like, this is a random aside, but that movie Saw, the original, where the guy's like chained to the bathtub and he needs a key. And we learn that in the first 30 seconds of the movie, he yanks the cork out of the tub, which the key's attached to, and the key he needs goes down the drain. And it's like, so we've been waiting the entire movie for this guy to find a way to free himself when he basically flushed his chance of freedom down the drain in the first 30 seconds. Like, just little moments like that that are kind of like, it says basically, screw the characters, like this horror is going
Yeah.
to unfold, and they could have prevented it, but they really had no way of knowing how to prevent
Right.
it. That's just sort of an
Right.
element that I always love about horror movies.
Yeah. It's like a so close yet so far kind of moment, you
Yeah,
know, like
exactly.
this could have all been avoided, yet it takes just a subtle someone's reaction or something to go wrong
Mhm.
just a little bit, just to throw off and actually build up this movie, which what comes out to be. Yeah, it's definitely that it's got like that, like you said, like it's like almost like a uniqueness of like how it could have been all it could have been all done in a couple of minutes, but again, the language barrier and all that kind of got in the way, and it just developed into this monster movie
Mhm.
that it came out to be, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess my question for you is like, what, when you hear about, or when someone mentions The Thing, what is the
Mm.
first element that comes to mind that you would define the movie by? Like, what about The Thing kind of separates it from any other horror movie you've seen?
I think for me it'd be just, I think the creature, once you get to see how
Mm.
it transforms, it's it's got like the disgusting slime thing, and then it's got like tentacles that come out of it, like it's just like, oh, it, I don't know, when I think of it, it's like the thing, it's like a nasty monster that you do not want to deal with, almost like a virus.
Hmm.
It would, that's what it is I think it's a virus. So yeah, I think of like the monster itself after seeing it. I think, yeah, that's probably the first thing that sticks to my mind. It's just like that scene where he's in with the where they first throw all the dogs together with the wolf,
Hmm.
and it's just like slime everywhere, and like the wolf turns into this monster, and it's just like tentacles flying everywhere. It's just, oh, it's gruesome and gross, and
Yeah, so you have to give a shout out to Rob Bottin, who was the special effects makeup guy that was basically the
yeah,
lead. And just his ability to kind of make all of these various hellish types of monsters and variations. And John Carpenter, one of the things that he said in an interview when when he was talking about like wanting to make it so special effects focused, and
yeah,
he had seen the original one as a kid, and the big difference between John Carpenter's version and the version in the film that it's a remake of is that in the original from the 50s, it's just a
yeah,
guy in a monster suit. Like it's
right,
just a guy walking around, and it's basically like Frankenstein in Antarctica in a lot of ways, which is what it looks like.
yeah,
And it's fine for that movie, but just the idea that he was able to take it to another place in terms
yeah,
of what, like this movie is regarded not only as being a fantastic example of practical effects, but also of being like cosmic horror. This idea that they're facing a monster, and we see the monster periodically throughout the almost 2 hours runtime of the movie, but we
yeah,
still can't define what the monster actually looks like because
right,
it's always evolving and it's always changing. And
yeah,
while we see certain things like some of the previous monster corpses we see, they're like half transformed. So it looks like
mm,
half a person, but they look kind of mutated.
yeah,
And then we see like little bits of the dog pop up every now and then. But then at the end of the day, we see some parts of it that they could be from other planets. They could be other monsters
right,
that it's consumed or other alien species. Like when they have the dogs in the kennel and those massive arms like grow out of its
oh
back and
yeah,
shoot up
yeah,
into the ceiling. And it's like
so,
it didn't get those massive arms from consuming a person or a dog. So like
right,
that could have been an example of an alien species or race that it came into contact with in a previous film or something
right,
like that, or a previous trip to another planet.
right,
That unknowing of like a final form is something that I've always really, really admired about this movie. Because a lot of
yeah,
those creature movies, like once you see it, you've seen it.
right.
And it never really evolves or changes or has much variation to it.
Yeah, there's like a good mystery to what it really is, which
Mhm.
I think it gives it its uniqueness. And definitely it keeps you waiting to really figure out, like it makes you think, and like what the hell is it? Because like it, every time we see it transform, it never really gets to take full,
Mhm.
like the process of evolving doesn't really fully get done, because either they burn them or they burn the monster, or like it gets cut halfway through, it's like feeding on a dog or something, and like, and we never get to see the full like evolution of it. But at the same time, we know that it's not human, like
Mhm.
it's definitely not like something from Earth.
Right.
uh, and again, I feel like the practical effects is definitely something they did a great job at it, and it gives it that creepy vibe to the movie that it's like, well, what the hell is it? It kind of gives it a face, but it doesn't really have a face
Mhm.
because it kind of evolves it. It all depends on what it eats, and it becomes part of that, if not all that. Um, but yeah, it's definitely kind of cool that the way they did that. It's for me, it's one of the first movies I feel like to think about it. I don't know if in the times of like I think it was like 82 that it came out.
Mhm. Yep,
Yeah, so it's like
82.
other than I feel like this is the first big practical effect movie for me that I would think that came out during this time. They like has this unique monster like vibe that you don't really know what it is, but you kind of want to keep watching to see what happens to it.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
it definitely has its uniqueness to it.
yeah, that ever evolving nature is really at the key of the terror of this movie. And it's one of the few movies that, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I go back and rewatch certain movies,
Mm.
it's never obviously going to be like the first time you watch the movie. You
Right.
can anticipate the scares, you kind of know what's generally going to happen and whatnot. And it does
Hmm.
lose a little bit of that kind of like oomph factor or scare
Yeah.
factor, rather. But then there's a few movies, The Thing being a prime example, where every time I watch it, it feels like the first time I watched it. And it's just a
Yeah.
testament to the timeless quality of the practical effects. And
Yeah.
like you said, how everything is so disgusting and slimy.
Yeah.
And it really does. Like they said that one of the key things in creating the different variations of the Thing was tapping into phobias. So we
Yeah.
have like especially the arachnophobia being a big part of it,
Hmm.
where we see in the dog it grows these spider legs out from it,
Yeah.
and then later on when there's one of the characters has the teeth in his stomach and his head
Yeah.
ends up getting ripped off, or his head removes itself from his body and it grows
Yeah.
spider legs again. Like those scenes, no matter, I've seen this movie probably 10 times
Yeah.
or 15 times over the course of the last decade, like those scenes still hit just as hard and they're still as
Right.
disgusting and creepy because they're
Yeah.
so rooted in those phobias and little things
Hmm.
that are just so disgusting and
Yeah.
creepy. And while obviously you know the different forms that the Thing will take, it is again that idea that like there's the off chance, maybe it doesn't make any sense why I would think this, but oh, maybe it'll change into something else or something new because it's
Yeah.
unknowing essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Like you said, like I feel like the phobia definitely for like a person, it definitely kind of creeps you out. Like that's something you can't really get rid of. Like the scary moments, yeah, you can. The more you watch it, you anticipate it. But the phobia itself, it's like if you have a phobia of something, I feel like it's always there. So you'll always find it
Mm-hmm.
creepy, and like you'll see a spider, no matter what size it is, it like freaks you out. You know, like certain people get freaked out by that, or get freaked out by snakes and all this weird, like just the way they move. And it definitely, I think, they did a good job at giving that it's like a freaky factor that the movie has because it hits all these phobias, like you said, which makes it unique in its own way. Because I don't think many other movies really go on. I mean, I'm sure there are movies, but it doesn't really do. I guess along with the practical effects that really adds on to that. Like you can see the hairs on the legs when they grow all the creepy spider legs and all just weird things.
Mm-hmm.
It gives it all definitely its uniqueness to it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like always coming back to the practical effects, which have become like the industry standard and the kind of
Yeah.
the reason why you should strive to use them. It's almost a 40-year-old movie, and the effects to this day, like I watched, or I can't remember if we had watched the 4K version together at one point, but even in the
Mm,
4K digital
yeah.
restoration of the movie, it still looks fantastic. It looks like they filmed it
Yeah.
yesterday in terms of just the quality of the practical effects is of a caliber so high that they don't
Yeah.
look aged at all. And it kind of
Mm,
just
yeah.
again speaks to the fact that like if you over rely on green screen or like computer generated imagery and things like that, even though it was pretty limited for the 80s in terms of what they could
Yeah.
do in that regard, it just speaks to this idea that if you put in the effort back in the day when you're making something, in the
Right.
future it's going to hold up. And
Right.
because the technology for the practical effects that they used in The Thing, it's a lot of the same techniques they use now in movies that are practical effects, and kind of
Right.
just the CGI stuff is always evolving. So of course that's not going to age well in
Right.
most regards in terms
Yeah.
of just the quality or kind of making it feel seamless to the
Mhm.
film. So
Yeah.
that's the one thing I think that really makes sort of Rob
Kind of
Bottin's.
sets the standards, yeah.
Yeah,
The standards
exactly.
for like practical effects, yeah, which it definitely, I mean, yeah, I feel like it's obviously going to evolve as we get more better technology. The CGI, like you said, it's
Mhm.
definitely going to evolve. But I think the practical effects of like of creeping people out, it's still that I feel like that's probably the standard of it, of having all these different phobias.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's definitely something that still carries on until today. Um, just I feel like a lot of it's like almost this phobia of being chased. Like I think of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like certain people that just hate being like chased at or like
Mhm.
have to run away from something. I feel like I personally would panic if someone's chasing me with like I know someone's killing me. Like I would run, but at the same time, it's like, oh man, when do you stop running?
Right.
Because I don't know. I just feel like that's also could be another phobia. But like just like they definitely set. I feel like John Carpenter definitely set the standards for what a monster should be
Mhm.
and the kind of like the way to really make people feel the creepiness of a monster with all these different practical effects, the slime, the legs coming out of and not the unknown, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah, he definitely did a good job at that, at setting that
So
sort of standard.
so what is one of your favorite scenes that kind of fully displays just how strong the practical effects are? Cuz there's a bunch, but like what's one of the
Yeah,
first ones that comes to mind for you?
I think the dog scene, the original when we first see the
The
monster,
kennel scene?
yeah, where he like also along with like we were talking about like the way the dogs are I guess like almost dog actors, like
Mhm.
it's really amazing to see how calm they were. Like they get introduced to this bigger wolf looking thing
Mhm.
and they throw him basically in a cage with all the other dogs, and the dogs themselves are really great at their job. I guess they're actors, the actor dogs.
Mhm.
I think that kind of helps sell that scene too. But yeah, like back to the monster, like that scene where like it builds up into like we get to see the first thing like it eats things and it starts evolving like them. I think that's just creepy stuff. It's just like I don't know. It's probably one of my. They're definitely the most memorable scene from the movie for me.
Yeah, what I really love about that scene too is that you hear the transformation before you see it. Like
Yeah.
you start to see the other dogs start to growl and they start to get
Mhm.
uneasy when the wolf is introduced to the kennel.
Yeah.
And then you also hear the wolf's transition into revealing that it's the thing first. Like there's that slight hissing sound that
Right.
doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like a dog like a noise that a dog or a wolf or any animal
Right.
would make in that scenario. Like
Yeah.
it's hissing, but it's not directing it towards anything. It's almost like you're letting the air or the gas out of something, which we see
Right.
once its face kind of like flays open and then it
Yeah.
pushes the skull out and reveals this elongated tongue and then the
Right.
spider legs and everything. Like the sound, not only is Carpenter's score really well, does his score complement the tone of the movie,
Yeah.
but just the sound design and the mixing in general of the monster. Like this is a little aside, but throughout the movie, like as the monster is starting to evolve and take on the forms of other things, one of the main things that it has trouble doing is replicating human voice. And we see
Yeah.
that when one of the characters gets taken over and they find him
Mm.
in that half transformation state. And he looks at him and like his hands are all fucked up and they look like claws.
Right.
And then he opens his mouth, but he can't speak. And he just like echoes this screaming sound that doesn't sound, it's very clearly screaming, but it doesn't sound human. And
Right.
like
Yeah.
just little moments like that, or the noises that the spider head makes at one point, where it's kind of like this weird, echoey kind of scream that's muffled in a certain way, is
Yeah.
just, it's super disturbing and it sends chills down my spine every time I hear it.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. The like you said, the way the sounds that it make, it definitely has that creepy, not from Earth feeling to it.
Mm-hmm.
That just adds more to the monster itself and to like me personally being curious as to what the hell it is. Like I want to see what the original form was. But yeah, it definitely it's kind of that now that you bring that up, that when the guy gets transformed into the monster, he's kind of like half transformed because his hands are still like monster like, but his body looks human.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of cool to really think about that. I didn't really think about the fact that it couldn't speak. It just made this random monster noise because I don't know. I just didn't think of it. I was like, oh, I was I wasn't really thinking about it. Oh, it's evolving and it can't really speak the human language.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of I don't know. It literally just struck me that I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I didn't think of it that way. Like it could never speak the language that we speak.
Yeah, it's cool that they cast this villain that is very much, it's not a perfect villain in the sense that I feel like a lot of the times antagonists in horror films, they're presented as not having any weaknesses,
Yeah,
especially, well, somewhat. They obviously
yeah,
always end up having some type of weakness, but they're
right,
presented initially early on as being invulnerable or something
right,
like that. And the idea that we get a monster that can take the shape of anything that it consumes essentially, and it blends in really well and it's deadly. The idea that if you catch it at the wrong moment, it exposes itself is
right,
something that I really think helps avoid the trope of humans being faced with a insurmountable foe in a lot of
right,
ways. Like it's not like when you have like, let's say, it's not fair to compare this to like slasher movies like Halloween or anything like that, but like the antagonists in those movies like Friday the 13th or that are scary because they're invulnerable.
right,
At the same time though, you can only go so far with that.
right,
By presenting a villain that it you or an antagonist that you can defeat and revealing a weakness like that at a very
mm,
opportune time, I think really lends itself to the different narrative potential of the
yeah,
story. Like this movie could have been, again, it could be a lot shorter if it was just them facing off an invulnerable monster, which kind of eventually takes the narrative conclusion that we would all assume it would. But by
yeah,
kind of like making it somewhat vulnerable, but still
mm,
being terrifying, I think really just speaks to how smartly they were able to adapt this from the remake. Or
yeah,
sorry, how they were able to adapt it from the original.
right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they definitely. I mean, I feel like we're talking about like at first we think about like yeah like you said it doesn't really have weakness, but then we slowly start figuring out that heat becomes like a source of weakness because all it wants to do is just preserve itself
Yeah.
to keep growing and growing, which is kind of it's kind of cool to think about it. But I feel like almost to get not to get too crazy about it, but I feel like that's virus nowadays. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
with this like unknown factor to it, that's like what does it really want to do? Like I don't know. I feel like viruses are like, especially with this whole COVID thing, it's like, like we don't like, you could see the characters, they're like even going through the, like later on to the movie when they start testing each other, it's like, well, who has it, who doesn't? Like, we don't really know who is, who's got the monster in them, who doesn't. It's like this unknown factor.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of almost like even watching it reminded me of like what's going on now with this virus. It's like you don't really know who has it until they get tested, and it's like the way they go about testing them. It's like they take the blood sample, and we know the heat is it's something they doesn't like, so they poke it with the hot iron stick,
Mm-hmm.
just to figure out, see if it's in your blood or something, and you might be possessed by it. It's definitely kind of creepy to think about it even nowadays. And it also goes to show you that kind of still holds up, although this virus, the COVID, it wasn't really supposed to happen, I guess. I don't know if it was or wasn't, but it's kind of creepy that you can kind of relate in that sense. It's like the unknownness of it, like whether
Mm-hmm.
you have it or not.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's definitely
that's something that gets overlooked a lot with this movie that
mm,
John Carpenter actually speaks to in the making of that I watched. There's a lot of parallels to real life in this movie that I think are almost equally as terrifying. Like
yeah,
a big part of this is the paranoia that all of
yeah,
the characters have amongst one another. Like this
yeah,
idea that you don't know who has it, you don't know who's going to infect you, and some people have actually interpreted that as being like a commentary on kind of like the AIDS crisis in the 80s,
mm,
because it's this idea that you start looking at people sideways because it's not a normal disease where there's a physical change on the outside that
yeah,
shows that. Like
right,
if somebody in your office gets the flu, it's very clear that they have the flu because of the way that they
right,
look, of the way that they behave.
mm,
But it's this idea that what if you get something that doesn't have any symptoms, like with COVID, which is so
right,
terrifying right now, and is why
yeah,
a lot of people are like so frightened, and rightfully so. Like it could be
mm,
anybody, and some people don't even show symptoms. So that
right,
part that taps into the paranoia, I think, if anything, it makes this film even more relevant than it's ever been before or since
right.
it was released.
You're right. Yeah, it also goes to show you like the like when something like this strikes, like the trust between humans.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot of loss of trust, and like should I really believe him? And it's like this little like connection that kind of gets lost even within the group, that the American group, that gets stuck and they're isolated there, like there's a loss of trust. And I feel like we definitely see that a lot here. Like nowadays it's like, well, yeah, I've been taking care of myself. Someone could say that, but you really deep down, it's like, well, I'm still kind of wearing a mask. Like I still
Yeah.
don't believe you in that
Right.
sense. So there's kind of that connection, which kind of, it's creepy to think about it, but yeah, it definitely has, it brings that out. Like, and then again, like I said, it's like, that's why it's still, I feel like this movie still holds up nowadays
Mhm.
because of that, like, connection of between the characters. Like, I don't trust, like, you tell me that you don't have this virus in you, but uh or this monster in you, but I still don't trust you. I need to test you.
Right.
And definitely kind of like that connection between the people that it still carries on to nowadays.
Yeah, and they didn't have social media to track and see who was
Right.
at the bar without a mask on yesterday or
Right.
whatever, like we do. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think so. For me, one of my favorite scenes in the movie in terms of the practical effects is the scene where um, Norris has a heart
Mm.
attack, basically, and they have to
Yeah.
take him to the infirmary, and they're going to revive him, and they're
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
the chest compressions, and then they get the defibrillator, and on the second defibrillator part, uh, Copper he
Yeah.
presses down on the guy's chest, and a mouth opens up with these jagged teeth, and we find out that Norris was infected. And then we
Yeah.
see obviously Copper loses both of his arms after the
Mhm.
teeth kind of slam shut on them. And it's a scene that I think is it was definitely influenced by Alien to a certain degree, like
Yeah.
with the chest burster scene.
Right.
And
Right.
I think it does such a good job of capturing just how sudden a change is in the thing.
Yeah.
Like I always know that scene is coming, but again, the split second difference between
Yeah.
thinking that a person is completely fine in regards to like they're human, and then in
Right.
a split second you realize like, oh shit, they were so not human, and then you look down and you just got nubs, just your
Right.
nubs are just leaking everywhere. Like it's so sudden and so disturbing that
Mhm.
it really is probably for me one of the most iconic moments in the entire movie in terms of
Yeah.
just how out there the effects are. And
Right.
that scene alone apparently took 10 hours to set up
Oh
because
wow.
they had to obviously give that actor a fake torso
Right.
and everything, even though that was his real head they were using.
Oh wow.
And then apparently the first time they did it, they fucked it up
Oh
because
geez.
when his stomach starts emitting all of the different like
Juices.
strands and juices and
Yeah.
whatnot,
Yeah.
John Carpenter said it looked like a fountain at Las Vegas or something.
Oh
Like it was
damn.
just so
Yeah.
over the top, like OD pressure
Yeah. Yeah.
shooting it out. So it looked like a fountain. And
Right.
then they had to obviously redo that. But it's one of those scenes where it really does just highlight again how fantastic the practical effects are, not only from the monster, which is incredible in terms of like the teeth are opening up and then they're
Yeah.
slamming shut on his arms, but also his arms, like he's standing there with those bloody nubs and like that's
Yeah.
still a super disgusting scene.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's just as gruesome and sudden and disgusting as it was like the first time I watched it and every time I've seen
Right.
it since.
Yeah. No, I definitely like that scene definitely kind of shows you even like the what the monster's capable. Like
Mm-hmm.
whenever it needs to, it's willing to evolve. Like whether it's like usually we see the change in the body itself, or like even when it opens its mouth, like it has different ways of killing you. It's not just a single way of like, I'm just gonna eat you, but like it can cut your arms off. Or I feel like even had we had we known more about it, like I feel like it could have like turned an arm into like a weapon and like stab you kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely shows you different ways that it could kill you. And it's kind of again like to the uniqueness of that monster. But yeah, that scene I think is definitely probably the second scene that sticks to me, like next to the dog one. Because that's something that I wasn't expecting the first time I saw it, because you would think, yeah, he's just going in to like revive him the second time, and it's like, oh shit, like he just went further, like just into this guy's stomach, and like
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden you realize that, oh, his arms are gone, and it's like blood everywhere, and then it starts like goosing out of the monster, spraying all this like green juice and liquid, and it's just, ugh, it's gross.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to that kind of unknowing quality about the final form or the
Yeah.
ways that it can manipulate its body into a weapon that really
Mm.
makes the movie a lot tenser, or the tension remains on multiple rewatches or on a dozen rewatches,
Yeah.
because that unknowable quality, at least for me especially, is just like, okay, I think I remember what happens, but what if it does this instead? Or you start to almost create these
Yeah.
scenarios that obviously are never going to actually unfold, but at the same time, like it's possible, and that kind
Yeah.
of speaks to my favorite parts of like cosmic horror movies, where it's like the antagonist is very unknowable and there is no final
Right.
form, which ultimately, if you were to be in that situation, like a lot of the time, if you watch Halloween or something like that,
Yeah.
inevitably you'll watch that movie with somebody and they'll be like, I would just run faster or I would do this or that. And it's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, because that villain, Michael Myers, is very predictable in what he does.
Right.
But then when you're faced with something that you can't actually kind of like predict what it's going to do,
Yeah.
like how do you counter that? It's kind of like
Right.
that Marvel villain Taskmaster, where his
Oh.
superpower is just memorizing everybody's moves by what he
Yeah.
basically watches like game tape on like Captain America, and he's like, I can counter that, I can counter that, I can counter that because I know what you're gonna do.
Right.
But this idea that you're faced with something and it's like, okay, first I'm gonna infect a dog, and then I'm gonna eat a guy with my stomach teeth,
Yeah.
and then I'm gonna and then I'm gonna have the head fall off and it be a spider. Like it
Yeah.
just keeps evolving and evolving and making the ceiling of scares basically
Yeah.
unknowable. Like
Right.
it can't really break the
Yeah.
ceiling because it never shows us the ceiling.
Right.
But I think now, since we've been talking about the practical effects for about 35
Yeah.
minutes, we should jump into like the characters,
Right.
because
Yeah.
this movie, every time I watch this, I'm amazed at the amount of characters that they have and just how
Yeah.
well they're fully fleshed out.
Yeah. They have a pretty good staff, or the cast itself is pretty great, I'd say, for the most part.
Yeah, 12. So the core
Yeah.
cast of people at the American base are 12 people deep.
Mm.
And of course, like Kurt Russell is at the helm of that.
Right.
But for as phenomenal as he is, like he's not the only solid performance. Like you would assume a movie that almost has 15 people in it would have a faulty character here or there. But for the
Mhm.
most part, they spend just enough time that you understand who these characters are, and enough of
Yeah.
their personality kind of comes out that
Right.
there is no real weak link in the character pool, as it
Right.
were.
They're all unique in their own ways. Yeah. No, definitely. I do. One of my favorite ones, I'd say, is Keith David, who plays Child.
Yeah.
I think he's definitely. I mean, we were talking about. I think that's one of his first roles.
Yeah, it was his first role, which
Yeah.
is
So
insane to think about.
right. Yeah. I think he did such a great job, and you kind of feel for him. He's like even the scene where he's like tied up. He's like, "Let me go!" Like like I don't know. I just feel like he sold that role so well. Like for being a first big time movie, that's probably, other than Kurt Russell's character, Mac. I think he's probably my second favorite one.
Yeah, absolutely. They all have such a good camaraderie too, which they said
Yeah.
was actually kind of like something that they actually had to channel in real life as well, because
Mhm.
they're in this isolated place and it's below 20 degrees or something and it's fucking freezing.
Right.
And they don't have anything else to do out there other than what they actually do in the movie, which is sit around and drink and watch old
Smoke.
videotapes and
Yeah.
smoke and bullshit
Yeah.
with one another. So
Right.
it really speaks to like, as grueling as those conditions were, they were pretty central to replicating that in the terms of like the narrative of the movie. And
Yeah.
I'm always amazed that we can get like a 60-second introduction to a character and we just learn so much about them as
Yeah.
who they are and what they're about. Like while Kurt Russell is the star and McCready is the focus for a lot of the movie, you only need about 30 seconds to understand what his character's about. Everybody
Right.
else is kind of socializing and he's up in his cabin drinking and playing chess on a computer.
Right. Yeah.
And then he loses and he destroys one of the only sources of entertainment they have out in the Antarctic. And it's kind of like, okay, this guy's a hothead who's
Right.
a loner, who's like a hard drinker. Like at least like on a rewatch, when I see that he's a loner, he's a hard drinker, it's like, what did he do in his past life that led him to this occupation? Kind of
Right.
thing.
How did he get here? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. How do any of these people that aren't scientists get here? Because
Yeah.
unless you're a scientist, why the hell would you ever want to be out in the middle of nowhere
Right.
with no women, limited entertainment? Like,
Right.
what is the incentive here?
Yeah, that's true. That's I feel like that'd be something that they probably could have expanded more on, like the background of the characters themselves, as to like how the hell did they get up there. But I think back to what you were saying, like about the cast, like I think that relationship that they all have, it's kind of cool to see that, like how everything seemed like, for me watching it, like it was like they all kind of got along in the sense that like they've been together for so long
Mhm.
that they kind of knew each other so well. And I think that relationship definitely helped give more life to the scenes when they were all together and like they knew exactly each other. Like they were kind of aware of each other's strength in a sense.
Mhm.
But obviously, once we find the monster, that you can kind of see that their relationship starts to fall apart, where there's no trust, and you see like this tight group, and then it slowly starts deteriorating because of this thing that can transform into any of them. But yeah, definitely, the cast I think did an amazing job, and it'd be more interesting to I'd be more interested to see how they'd explain more about their backstory of how they got like even Kurt Russell, his character seems like he was almost an army guy. He just the security guard at
Mhm.
the facility, or what did he do? Because he knew so much about guns, and it seems like he knew how to fly. I think he was the one flying the helicopter or something.
Yeah, I think he's the only helicopter pilot.
Yeah, so it's like how the hell did like what was his key like role before that, you
Mhm.
know? So I'd be interested how they explain more about that. That'd been kind of cool.
Yeah, so like the camaraderie between them too, I feel like that is what sells the paranoia so well. It's almost like
Yeah,
if you and I were with our group of mutual friends, and
yeah,
it's like we're all such good friends, and yet one person has the capacity to take everybody else out. You
right,
know what I mean? Like, and not
yeah,
knowing who it is, and if somebody knew, they could be lying potentially. Like,
right,
that adds a sort of tragic quality to it. And while
yeah,
these guys are all coworkers, they're a little more than that because they spend 24 hours a day with
right,
one another. And so
yeah,
for them to be such familiars with one another and to be
mhm,
somewhere in between friends and coworkers, it
yeah,
makes the paranoia that much more tragic because it's like
right,
this person that I was just like palling around with and watching old episodes of The Price is Right, getting stoned in my room with,
yeah,
like Childs
yeah.
and I think it was Fuchs.
Yeah, I
Oh no,
think
it was Palmer. Excuse me,
Palmer,
the
yeah,
like stoner guy.
yeah,
This idea that like, oh, sure, we're sharing a joint, but then you look at him the next moment, like he could have teeth coming out of his stomach or something like that,
right,
and
yeah,
it's very believable that they would be distrustful of one another if they weren't friends. You
mm,
know what I mean? Like if it's just
yeah,
if it's somebody you don't know and there's a
yeah,
possibility they could kill you, you'd just be like, okay, fuck
yeah,
them, like I'm
yeah,
out. But this idea
right,
that you are actually invested in one another to a certain degree, it makes the idea that you might have to flamethrower one of them that much
right,
more like emotionally charged.
yeah,
Like you have to have some hesitation of that. And
right,
that's one of
yeah,
the elements I think that separates McCready is that he's such a loner
right,
that he doesn't want to have to shoot Clark when Clark tries to jump him with the scalpel. But at the
yeah,
same time, like he has no qualms about killing somebody if they're going to try to
right.
kill him.
Yeah, he kind of like distanced himself. Like he's aware enough that they're friends, but at any time they can turn on you, kind of thing. He
Right.
definitely has that characteristic of a loner, like you were saying. But yeah, definitely that relationship between McGreedy and all the rest of the guy. I feel like all the other guys are more innocent and they're just there to do their job, and McGreedy seems to be the kind where it's like he, to me, I don't know why, but every time I think of his character, I think of like he's definitely got some kind of military background because he's like you said, he's a loner, he's on his own, but yeah, he knows he's got these people to help him out, but at the same time, like you said, he didn't hesitate to shoot. Um, who was it?
Clark.
The guy that yeah, Clark. He jumped at him with a knife. He didn't even hesitate to do it. So it's like there's some kind of like something different about him that separates himself from this whole group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what just helps is that Dean Cundy, who's the cinematographer, and obviously John Carpenter's direction, they do such a great job of bringing Lancaster's script to life in terms of exposing just how bare their environment is and how like you're surrounded by all these people and you have these some sources of entertainment, which it's up for debate whether having like large stockpiles of liquor and guns is a good
Yeah.
combination, but they really do make you feel like you're 1,000 miles away from civilization when you're
Mhm.
watching this. The idea that you're on your own, you're in this one area that's hospitable for human life, and now you're trapped in there with the most inhospitable antagonist you could ever have in terms of the
Yeah.
monster. Like he really does. They do such a fantastic job of just highlighting the terror of this environment, which is inherently hostile, but
Mm.
it's not a lot happens in the environment.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we hear that they
Yeah.
get snowed in at the end of the movie, but at the same time, like it's not. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess it's very much a barren environment that the weather itself is what puts them at bay most of the movie.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like people aren't freezing to death and things like that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, like the weather. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's like so the weather is something that kind of keeps them in, but it's not enough to harm any of the humans. They're more terrified of what is what could be inside them
Mm-hmm.
as this monster creature. But yeah, definitely, I think they did a great job at setting up the environment and like the just this loneliness of like them just being there by themselves with no one for miles and miles near them. They could definitely they it definitely gives you that isolated feeling of like, well, you can't run anywhere because there's just ice and snow all around us. There's nowhere to go. The helicopters at one point gets broken because they don't want anybody to escape. Um, and it definitely, yeah, they definitely give you this sense of isolation. I think they did a great job, like you said, at basically showing like, this is they're in the middle of nowhere researching this stuff, and they came across this dog with a virus. And yeah, they definitely did a great job at that.
I think the point I was trying to make, which I didn't make very well, was that the idea that the film begins and everywhere outside of the research facility is terrifying in the sense that, like, you can freeze to death out there. If you don't have the proper resources, you'll die out there. And then they almost make, since the research station is like the last safe haven in that area, it's the only place
Yeah,
where life can live. By inserting a monster in there, that makes it the most dangerous place
right.
in all of, like, they would almost be better off taking their chances out into just the snow.
Yeah,
Like
right,
they could it's more than likely they would still freeze to death and whatnot.
right,
But at the same time, are you going to take your chances with the elements or with an alien that is going to
right.
consume you? Like
Yeah,
it's an interesting parallel that I don't think I appreciated until recently. Just the
mm,
idea that the entire the flip flopping of what is like a hostile environment and which one is the safe haven, and then they essentially
yeah,
switch at the end of the movie. And
right,
I'm almost surprised that we don't have a character break down and actually do that. Like,
right.
fuck
Yeah,
this, I'm out. I can't trust anybody. I'm just gonna go wander off into the snow, kind
yeah.
of thing.
That would have been nice to see actually. Like someone just like be like, all right, I'm gonna risk it all and just I take my chances on walking miles and miles, and then just actually deal with this monster that might be in me, might be in you. I don't know who has it, who's getting possessed by it. But yeah, that'd be really cool to see, because I feel like we definitely see that a lot in like movies nowadays, where it's like you have that one character where it's like, all right, I'm leaving this situation. Obviously, they end up dying,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like there's always that one guy who's like, yeah, or I could just go do something else, like
Yeah.
go walk myself to safety, I guess, or
There's always that one character that kind of opts out. Everybody's like,
yeah,
we have to survive this, and he's just like, nope, I'm
no,
not
yeah,
surviving anything. Like,
yeah.
I'm taking
There's
it in
better,
my own. I'm going out on my own terms.
yeah.
And while we're here to celebrate the anniversary of the original of not the original of John Carpenter's remake, did you see the one that came out into the thing that came out in 2011?
I did not see it. I've seen part of it, but I have not
Okay,
fully seen.
so I watched that movie recently for the first time, and I'd never
Mm,
seen it. And the reason I'd never seen it was you can't outdo John Carpenter's.
right.
Like,
Yeah.
there's no way you're going to be able to outdo it. And the remake, or it's a prequel to
Yeah.
John Carpenter's The Thing. It takes place in the Norwegian base or another research
Oh,
facility.
okay.
And the biggest mistake that movie made is that it went from the practical effects to the CGI.
Oh, yeah.
And it just does not, the CGI is not particularly good.
Yeah.
I think the
Kind of
CGI,
loses that touch.
yeah, exactly. It
Yeah.
loses that touch. And it's like that movie, the prequel is only 9 years old at this point, and the
Oh,
CGI already looks dated, and it looks terrible, in my opinion.
damn. Yeah.
The CGI does do a good job of kind of like it keeps the trend going of this unknowing horror. We see all these
Mhm.
new different forms that the thing can take, and it does
Yeah.
tap into that idea that it is a cosmic horror monster, in that it's unknowing what it's going to do next, what it's going to evolve into, which adds a certain layer of tension. And there's certainly some disgusting parts in that
Yeah.
movie, like super gory and whatnot. But again, it is CGI and it already looks dated and it's not even a decade, which
Some shit.
reinforces the original in that the original now is almost 38 years old. And the practical effects, again, they look like it was filmed yesterday in
Right.
terms of its quality.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember seeing part of it, but I don't fully remember the full movie. I just know that there was it was like almost like a slug, a monster kind of
Yeah, so
alien slug
that
thing.
was one of the forms where like this guy's hand comes off and then his hand turns into a slug basically, and then the slug hand monster tries to like go in somebody's mouth.
Jesus, yeah.
But yeah, I mean that movie. Another thing I didn't like that I think reinforces how strong the narrative Bill Lancaster's script was for John Carpenter's is that it doesn't try to explain too much, where the new film tries to explain too much. Like in John Carpenter's, we see that the thing is essentially stealing components to make a spaceship to leave Earth.
Right.
In the prequel, we actually see the ship.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
And there's this whole section with the ship, but something is lost in that.
Yeah.
It kind of it shows too much. And I don't know. It's not that it's different than John Carpenter's. It's just this idea that like there's no mystery left to anything.
Right.
Like in Carpenter's, we see the brief moment where the ship flies in and lands on the planet, and then we see it in the ice, basically when Kurt Russell takes a crew up to go investigate where the Norwegian dig site was.
Yeah, they go underground.
Yeah. So that part is cool. Just because it's brief glimpses, there's still plenty of mystery behind it. Whereas when it's shown explicitly to the viewer, and I think that final scene where they investigate the ship in the prequel is about 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes. It just shows too much. And once the mystery is gone, you're just like, this almost becomes more sci-fi than horror in a certain way.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like that would definitely, I probably would not want to see where it came from or what kind of ship it came in. Like you said, I think it would definitely lose that mystery touch. I should go back and watch it. I definitely have to just to, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't as good as the first one. I'm expecting it not to be, but just to see how everything ties in together, or they try to tie in together.
Yeah, I don't think that the movie is terrible. A lot of people say it's terrible or atrocious, but that's because they're solely comparing it to John Carpenter's, which is a ridiculous angle to take because it's nothing's going to compare to that.
Right.
There's no way that they will ever make anything in that universe as good as John Carpenter's. But
I feel like that's I feel like it's kind of hard to beat the original one. Definitely.
Once you remove your comparisons to the John Carpenter's, on its own, it's a pretty decent movie. It's decent.
Yeah.
It's hurt by a lot of things, and it's certainly not as successful as the original or even some standard horror movies. Like the characters are not nearly as memorable, or they are don't have personalities that are nearly as defining or interesting or engaging. Yeah. But it does have cool monster design, even if the CGI to bring them to life is flawed. But it's definitely not as atrocious. So I would say as much as you like the thing, there are certain elements of it that you would actually enjoy, that you would probably enjoy. It's one of those things where fans of John Carpenter's hate that prequel because it pales in comparison. And yet fans of John Carpenter's The Thing, like you and I, would appreciate the kind of like nuances that are in the monster design and things like that. So
I'd probably definitely end up watching it.
Yeah, I would say it's worth checking out. It's just make sure you follow up watching that with the original.
Right. Yeah.
Put things back into perspective.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely have to check it out. I mean, I feel like to follow John Carpenter's and try to kind of if he doesn't have a part, I feel like if he doesn't have a part in the movie, then it probably won't be as good. I feel like you definitely lose that touch of the original, I guess the original creator in a sense, like the original director. But yeah, you definitely, I feel like you probably lose that touch. But I'll still watch it just to, because I think I've seen it, but it was just probably a long time ago. I don't remember much of it. I just remember, like I said, that slug thing. But other than that, that was all I remember from it.
Yeah, I mean, not terrible, not great, but you'll probably get something out of it more than people that are
appreciate
unable,
little moments.
people that are unable
Yeah.
to kind of remove their bias. But
Right.
in kind of closing out, were there any other elements of The Thing that we didn't touch upon that you wanted to?
No, I think we hit them all. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about the dog. Yeah. No, I think we definitely hit them all.
It's always so refreshing when you return to a movie on its anniversary after like a certain chunk of time.
Yeah.
Like generally the anniversaries are only really official when it's like a decade, 2 decades, 3, 4 decades.
Right.
It's really refreshing to return to a movie or to keep returning to one and it being
Yeah.
just as enjoyable as the first time you watch it.
Right.
And it
Yeah.
hasn't lost any of its kind of bite or the things that make it so defined in kind of the lineage of horror movies and
Yeah.
whatnot. Like it's sometimes, especially I've had this problem in the past with movies from the 80s, returning to some of the ones that are like the classics.
Yeah.
Some of them I find are kind of caught up in the clout of
Mhm.
they were the first ones to do something, but sometimes that's not always indicative or something that has actually done something that's super refined in
Right.
terms of like introducing a new concept that might at the time have been radical. When you look
Yeah.
back in 30 or 40 years, it might not have the same kind of effect that it used to.
Right.
That's certainly not the case with this movie.
Right. Yeah. It still hits those, like we've talked about, those phobias and those nasty. I think the practical effect is basically the selling point of the movie in a sense,
Mhm.
like, which like you really get to see like how well it could be done. Like practical effects, although nowadays we have CGI, I think practical effects could also still like, I mean, as it hasn't evolved as much as CGI, but you can still do a lot of great things with it and it brings more realistic to it
Mhm.
instead of always having a green screen in that sense. I mean, back in the day they had I mean, there was a couple of scenes where they had green screen, but
Yeah.
the practical effect, it's something about the fact that it's there, you can touch it, you can see it, it's like, it just makes it different. I feel like for the actors, I'm sure it's also a lot easier if something's there they can see and touch
Yeah.
and sometimes smell. I feel like the creature
Absolutely.
smelled gross.
Oh, I bet.
Always slimy and ugh. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And I think if people really dig movies like this, like I'm trying to get better at recommending things that are similar to what I'm recording or
Yeah.
reviewing rather. A movie came out a few years ago and I'm pretty sure I forced you into watching it, The Void.
The Void?
Yeah. Did
I think we might have watched it.
Yeah. So that movie came out, I think 3 years ago now. But yeah, definitely check out The Void if you haven't. It has a lot of the same practical effects that are very clearly influenced by John Carpenter and The Thing. And its narrative is not nearly as good and whatnot, but I think it's one of the few recent examples of movies that they opted to do heavily practical effects. And it really comes across in kind of conveying the same tone of this unknowing, ever evolving creature that, like you said, if you can touch it, it looks real and it has that kind of effect. And it is just super impressive. And I recommend that movie as well. Not that it is necessarily super similar to The Thing, but it kind of continues on in terms of talking about the lineage of John Carpenter's The Thing and that we're almost at the 40th anniversary. Like it's nice to see it still have such an apparent influence on modern horror films and whatnot.
Yeah, no, that I feel like it's definitely goes down as one of the classics, The Thing. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bunch of them, but I feel like the standard of, like we've been talking about, the standard of practical effects is definitely there. That it's kind of got set by John Carpenter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's awesome to have something like that. I mean, it just shows you like even nowadays it's still a great movie, and just if you do something right, like it can literally just live a lifetime almost.
Yeah.
As far at least our lifetime.
Yeah.
We'll see how much longer it's still going to be liked. But at least for me and for you, I'm sure it's still a great movie, although it's been made way before our time.
Mm-hmm.
It still like holds up, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect final words on The Thing. So I appreciate you coming on and getting to revel in a film that we both love a lot for the 38th anniversary.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
No problem, anytime. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram or @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.